ever think about like being the first one there after a hurricane or a flood, or even, when something like a massive oil spill happens, it's got to be complete chaos, right? And you're the one who has to bring order to it all. That's what emergency response workers deal with every single day. So today we're going deep on what makes this kind of work, which is obviously super demanding, so incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not your typical 9 to 5. It's challenging for sure, but being able to actually directly make a difference in people's lives is, I think, what makes it so fulfilling.
Okay, so RoleCatcher calls them unsung heroes. But what are they actually doing day to day, these emergency response workers?
Well, they're the first ones in, right? Responding to, you name it, natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, or even those man-made crises like a big oil spill.
So it's more than just cleaning up after the fact.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like it's a ton of different tasks, all happening at once,
Mm.
and often in really stressful, dangerous places. So what does that actually look like on the ground?
Think coordinating how all the debris gets cleared out, making sure everybody's safe sometimes. That even means getting people out of harm's way, evacuations, that kind of thing. And then making sure that all the crucial supplies, food, water, medical aid, get to where they're needed most. And fast. It's a huge, huge job.
And the role catcher guide was saying they're often working in really remote areas, hazardous locations, dealing with dangerous materials. And then on top of all that, the emotional weight of, just being surrounded by so much trauma. So what qualities do you think someone needs to not just survive, but actually thrive in that kind of setting?
Resilience. That's got to be number one. You need someone who can think on their feet, adapt super quickly because things are changing constantly. Someone who's a natural problem solver, especially when the pressure's on.
It's almost like they need a sixth sense for knowing how to make the right call in
Yeah.
the heat of the moment, knowing that people's lives could depend on it.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not just about being quick on your feet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Compassion and empathy are huge too. You can't underestimate that. You're dealing with people at their most vulnerable who've just been through something terrifying. Being able to offer comfort, just being there to support them, it's as critical as any technical skill, for sure.
That makes a lot of sense. It's that balance of being able to manage your own emotions while also being this like rock for other people in the middle of chaos. And then the role catcher guide also really emphasizes how important teamwork and communication are in these situations, which makes sense because the stakes are so high.
Absolutely, because if you don't have clear communication, things can go south really, really quickly.
Oh.
You're working so closely with other first responders, police, firefighters, paramedics, and you have to coordinate everyone's efforts so that it's one unified response.
And that takes us to training, which is a big one. So the guide mentions a few things like needing certification in first aid, CPR, training as a hazmat technician, even EMT certification. Is that it? Or is that just, the tip of the iceberg?
Yeah. Those are definitely essential to even be considered for a job, absolutely. But honestly, in this line of work, the learning never really stops. The guide stresses that a lot. Continuous learning, going to workshops, hitting those seminars, staying on top of the latest technologies and how emergency response strategies are evolving, because they do. It's a field that's always changing.
So it's that commitment to being a lifelong learner, to constantly be improving your skills because no two emergencies are the same, right? Now, I thought the guide's breakdown of a typical career path for someone just starting out was really interesting. So you begin as a trainee and you can work your way all the way up to becoming a manager. You start by assisting more senior workers, just learning the ropes, and then you can progress to leading teams, actually developing those emergency response plans, even conducting post-disaster assessments.
And what's cool is it's not just about climbing a ladder.
hmm
Every single stage comes with more responsibility and also gives you a chance to really find what you're best at, to specialize a bit. So when you're a trainee, it's all about hands-on experience, helping out with things like clearing debris, transporting supplies, and just learning those protocols and procedures by heart.
So you're building that super solid foundation, which is what's going to prepare you for those leadership roles later on.
Exactly.
So then what does that progression look like, say, in those very early stages?
When you move from trainee to... So when you transition to being a full-fledged emergency response worker, that's when you take on more leadership. You might be coordinating entire cleanup operations, making sure everyone's following safety protocols. You might even be involved in actually developing those emergency response plans. The guide mentions one worker at this level who talked about working with the local authorities, organizations, to figure out the best way to get aid and support to those who need it. So it becomes a much more strategic role.
Yeah, the bridge between the immediate on-the-ground action and then that larger response effort.
Yeah, exactly.
Then what happens is you move into those even more kind of senior positions.
So once you hit that senior emergency response worker level or you become emergency response manager, you're shifting gears. Now you're thinking less about the crisis that's happening right now and more about how to prepare for the next one. You're in charge of whole teams. You're the one creating those big picture emergency response plans for entire organizations. And you're the one making sure that those plans meet all the regulations and industry standards. It's a big, big responsibility.
Now, one thing RoleCatcher emphasizes, and I thought this was interesting, is the value of getting practical experience, even before you land a job.
Oh, it's huge. Volunteering, especially with local emergency response organizations or even just participating in drills, those simulations, it's invaluable
Yeah.
because it gives you something concrete to talk about in an interview, real world experience.
Speaking of interviews, RoleCatcher has this whole section dedicated to interview prep, and it is seriously in-depth. They even have this, like, AI-powered practice tool that gives you feedback on your answers.
It's wild, right? Technology is completely changing how people prep for interviews. It's not just about giving you an idea of what to expect anymore. It's like having a coach almost. They're helping you practice how you respond, how you present yourself, which, let's be honest, can make or break an interview.
They even list out common questions you might get asked, like, tell me about a time you had to make a quick decision when everything was hitting the fan. You know, that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one. It's a behavioral question. They're trying to see how you handle pressure, how well you make decisions when you don't have a lot of time to think. The key with this one is to use something called the STAR method: situation, task, action, result, and nest. It's a way to structure your answer so you give them a specific example that actually shows off your skills in action.
It's one thing to just say, I'm a great decision maker. It's another thing to illustrate that with a story that actually happened. How can someone make those stories really stand out,
Yeah.
especially if they don't have a ton of formal experience yet?
That's where those volunteer experiences, or even just having done a few drills, can be clutch. Let's say you volunteered at, I don't know, like a community event or something, and someone got hurt. Even if it wasn't super serious, being able to talk about how you provided first aid, how you stayed calm and collected even though you were still learning, that shows you can perform under pressure.
So it's about drawing on those real-world moments, even if they're on a smaller scale.
Exactly.
So to kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive here, we've covered a lot, and it's all thanks to RoleCatcher and how thorough their resources are. We talked about what an emergency response worker actually does day to day, what it's really like to work in that kind of environment, and then how important ongoing training and interview prep are. Out of everything, what would you say is the biggest takeaway for our listener? What do they really need to remember?
I think what RoleCatcher really drives home is that to be an emergency response worker, it takes a really specific mix of like skills, sure, but also personal qualities. You need that sharp mind, that ability to make decisions when things are crazy, but you also need a huge heart. You need that compassion and empathy to connect with people who are going through something unimaginable. Then you can't forget about always learning, that professional development piece because
Yeah.
it's a field that just keeps evolving, so you have to evolve with it.
You're always adapting, always learning, always finding new ways to, like you said, make a difference. And speaking of making a difference, something that really stood out to me in the RoleCatcher guide was how much they emphasized the human impact of this work. It's not just about logistics and protocols. It's about being there for people on what might be the worst day of their lives. What advice would you give to our listener who's feeling drawn to this work? Someone who has that desire to be that beacon of hope for someone.
I think more than anything, trust that gut feeling. If you feel called to this kind of work, if you have that deep down desire to help, to serve, explore it, don't let anything hold you back. And a great place to start is with what RoleCatcher provides. They've got a roadmap. They've got even more in-depth stuff on how to create a killer resume and cover letter that's going to stand out, how to network the right way within the industry, and even how to navigate salary negotiation, which can be a little tricky.
So it's like having this toolkit of resources to help you succeed, not just in getting the job, but in building a career that you actually love.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that as an emergency response worker, the work you do has a ripple effect. It's not just one person you're helping, it's a whole community. Every single life you touch, every act of kindness, every moment of support, it matters. It really, really does.
It's about being a part of something so much bigger than yourself, contributing to something meaningful.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great way to put it.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this first part of our deep dive into the world of emergency response workers. But don't worry, we'll be back with even more insights from RoleCatcher, and I promise you do not want to miss it.
It's true. It's not just dealing with the crisis when it's happening, it's what happens after, too. Processing all that, the emotional weight of what you see, what you experience on the job. Because emergency responders, they're dealing with stuff most people can't even fathom.
And they're the ones running towards the danger when everyone else is trying to get away. Talk about a different kind of strength,
Right.
right? And the RoleCatcher guide, they talk about burnout, which makes total sense given how intense the work is. So how can someone prepare for that emotional toll?
Mhm.
If they're thinking about going into this field, what can they do?
Building resilience is huge, like we talked about before, having those coping mechanisms, a good support system, and knowing when to ask for help. Because that's important too. A lot of organizations have counseling specifically for first responders, support groups, that kind of thing. And just being able to talk to someone who gets it, who understands what you're going through, can be like a game changer.
It's true. That whole idea of taking care of your mental health, it's just as important as the physical stuff, right? Especially in a job where you're constantly giving so much of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup. And speaking of support, we were talking about technology earlier, and I thought it was so interesting how the RoleCatcher guide was really emphasizing how important tech is becoming in this field.
Oh, it's changing everything, no question. Drones, for example, they're using those now for damage assessment. So you get that real-time view from the air. You can see what's going on in the disaster zone, which helps responders allocate resources way more effectively.
It's amazing.
Right. And then there's VR, virtual reality. They're using that for training now, which is incredible. New recruits can be thrown into these simulated disaster scenarios before they're ever in the field for real.
Wow, it's like taking those practice drills to a whole other level.
Totally. And then even something as simple as mobile apps, the stuff we use every day, they use those to streamline communication between teams on the ground. Everyone's on the same page getting real-time updates.
It's amazing how something so commonplace like messaging can literally be a lifeline in those situations.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about satellite imaging. That's huge for tracking disasters, seeing how things are developing, monitoring weather patterns. Like, they can predict the path of a storm or a wildfire now.
So you're not just reacting to the disaster anymore, you're trying to anticipate what's going to happen.
Exactly. Using all the data, all the technology to stay one step ahead, to try and lessen the impact as much as possible. And honestly, this is just the beginning. I mean, imagine AI-powered systems that can take all this data and actually optimize, like, evacuation routes or predict which areas are most likely to flood.
It's like we're getting to a place where we can get ahead of the disaster instead of constantly playing catch-up.
Totally. But here's the thing to remember. As amazing as all this technology is, and it is transforming the field, it's not a replacement for human judgment, for compassion, for that ability to make a decision in a split second when lives are on the line.
It's using technology to do things better, to work smarter, not harder, but never losing sight of the human element. That's at the heart of this work. Now, I thought the RoleCatcher guide did a really great job of breaking down specific skills that employers want to see. And they even categorize them by how much experience you have. So for someone who's just starting out, what are those must-have skills, the ones they should really focus on?
The fundamentals are key when you're first starting out. Having that basic first aid and CPR certification, knowing those emergency response procedures like the back of your hand, and being a clear, concise communicator. Super important.
So building that strong foundation
Yeah.
makes sense. But as you move up, as you get more experience, those skills need to evolve too.
Right. Absolutely. For more senior level roles, you've got to have those leadership skills. Being able to create those emergency response plans and then actually putting them into action. You've also got to have experience doing those post-disaster assessments, those debriefs.
And now you're not just responding to the crisis as it's happening. You're looking back and figuring out, okay, what worked, what didn't work, and how can we improve things for next time?
Exactly. It's about constantly learning and adapting, which is so important in this field. Nothing stays the same for long.
Now, beyond those core skills, are there any certifications that someone can get that might give them a leg up in the job market?
Oh, for sure. The guide mentions a few, like becoming a certified hazardous materials technician, or getting your EMT certification, emergency medical technician, or even getting certified in the incident command system, ICS.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about those. What's so valuable about having those specific certifications?
Having those certifications, it's like you're showing employers that you're serious, that you've got specialized knowledge in these really critical areas. And when you're applying for jobs, when you're up for a promotion, that can make all the
It's
difference.
like having that extra stamp of approval on your resume,
Yeah.
that sets you apart.
Exactly. But it's more than just checking a box. To get these certifications, you've got to go through these really rigorous training programs. So employers know you've got the actual skills and the knowledge to handle those really high-risk situations. It's not just theory, you've lived it.
It bridges that gap between like what you learn in a classroom and what you're actually going to be doing in the field, which in this line of work is huge. Now, once you've got the skills, you've got the experience, RoleCatcher really stresses how you present all of that, especially in an interview. They talk about this thing called the STAR method, which we touched on a little bit
Oh,
earlier.
yeah, the STAR method. It's a really good way to structure your answers so you're highlighting your skills and experience in a way that's super clear and concise.
It's like storytelling almost.
Kind of, yeah. It's about bringing your resume to life. Instead of just listing off bullet points, you're giving them a story that they're going to remember.
Right. So how can someone use this STAR method to answer those common interview questions we were talking about?
So let's say they ask that classic question. Tell me about a time you had to make a decision under pressure. Instead of just saying, I'm a great decision maker, use the STAR method. Walk them through it. Think of a specific example, something that actually happened, maybe in a volunteer role, maybe in some kind of training exercise. Then you describe the situation, what was going on. Then you talk about the task at hand. What was your responsibility? Then the action you took. And then the result of that action.
Show, don't tell. I like that. But even with an amazing story, how you tell it matters too, right?
Peak time. RoleCatcher talks about how important it is to actually practice your answers, record yourself if you can, because sometimes how we sound in our heads is not how we sound out loud.
Being self-aware, right. Because you might have the best experience in the world, but if you can't talk about it in a way that's engaging, it's going to be hard to stand out.
And that's where those AI-powered interview practice tools that RoleCatcher talks about can be so helpful. You can practice, get feedback, all from home.
It's like having an interview coach in your back pocket. They're helping you polish those answers, think about your body language, projecting confidence. That's huge too.
Huge, because when you believe in yourself, when you believe in your abilities, it shows.
And speaking of confidence, I was really impressed by how detailed RoleCatcher is about what kind of questions to expect.
They really do a good job of taking the mystery out of the whole interview process, so you're not going in blind.
Exactly. They even give you tips on those tougher questions, like what are you looking for, salary-wise? Or where do you see yourself in 5 years? Which can sometimes throw people off.
Yeah, those can be tricky. The key is to be prepared. For the salary question, do your homework. Know what the average salary range is for your position, for your experience level, for your area, and then go in knowing what you bring to the table, what you're worth.
Know your worth, but be realistic too.
Exactly. And for those career goal questions, it's okay if you don't have it all figured out, if you're still figuring things out. Just make sure you emphasize that you're committed to growth, that you want to learn, that you want to evolve within the organization.
Show them you're in it for the long haul, you're not afraid of hard work, and you're excited to learn and grow.
Exactly. And one last tip. Don't be afraid to ask questions at the end. When they ask, do you have any questions for us? Have a couple ready. It shows you've done your research, that you're curious, that you're genuinely interested.
It's your turn to interview them a little, right? Show them that you're serious about this. So we've covered a lot. What are the big things to remember from this RoleCatcher guide? If our listener takes away one or two things, what should they be?
I think the biggest thing is that to be an emergency response worker, it really takes, this really unique combination of skills for sure, but also just like who you are as a person. You've got to have that sharp mind, be able to think clearly under pressure, but then you've also got to have that huge heart because you're dealing with people at like the worst moments of their lives. You've got to have that compassion, that empathy to connect with them in that way. And then beyond all that, you've got to be committed to constantly learning new things. Because the field is always changing, So you've got to want to change and grow with it.
It's almost like you're always adapting, always learning new things, always figuring out how to make a difference in new ways. And I think that's a perfect segue into this next point. Because one thing that really stuck with me from the RoleCatcher guide was how much they emphasize the human impact of this work. It's not just boxes to check and procedures to follow, right? It's about showing up for people in a really profound way, often on the worst day of their lives. So for our listener who's hearing this, who's feeling that pull towards this kind of work, that desire to be that source of strength for someone, what advice would you give them?
I always say trust your gut. If this feels right, If you've got that deep down desire to help people, to serve others, don't ignore it. Explore it. Don't let fear hold you back. You've got this. And a really great place to start, honestly, is with the stuff that RoleCatcher provides. It's like they've laid out a roadmap, you know? They've got even more detailed stuff on how to create a killer resume and cover letter, how to network the right way, which is so important in this field. And even like the whole salary negotiation thing, which we all know can be a little awkward.
It's like having that toolkit, those resources to help you build a career you love and feel good about.
Yeah, for sure. And the other thing is, just remember, as an emergency response worker, what you're doing. It has this ripple effect. It's not just about that one person you helped that day. It's their family, their friends, their entire community. Every life you touch, every time you show up with kindness and compassion, it matters.
It's about being a part of something so much bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, that is all the time we have for today's deep dive into the incredible world of emergency response workers. Hopefully you learned a lot. And if you're thinking about this path for yourself, you're feeling inspired, you're ready to take that next step. A huge thanks to RoleCatcher for those incredible resources. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and never forget how powerful you are and the difference you can make.